I think that a lot of people, it's almost just kind of an automatic thing that the camp is there because it's been here for so long. It's served many generations of people, and it's had a big impact on people too. The history of Green Lake Bible Camp began in the 30s. There was a movement afoot during that time where churches were discovering that taking kids for a week or so during the summer when they weren't in school and giving them some religious education was beneficial, not only for them spiritually and mentally, but physically. This property that we're on today was owned by Peter Bondi, who was the sheriff of Candy, Ojai County at the time. But he was actually a very religious person and heard about the need for a camp. And so he negotiated a deal with the churches in the area for a grand total, I think, of $12,000. Of course, the churches didn't have a nickel during the 30s. It was the Depression after all. They went back to their churches and said, oh, by the way, we bought a camp. We need to be able to pay for it. And somehow they were able to raise the money eventually and acquire the property. That was in 1938. And that was the first year, I understand, that the camp was held on this site. The one thing that they lacked was a chapel. The first few years, as I understand, they worshiped in a big circus tent. Found out pretty quickly that that wasn't very conducive for worship in the summertime with mosquitoes and rain and wind and heat. So pretty quickly, the board of directors decided that we needed to build a chapel. One of them had a contractor in his church who had just recently visited Norway, and he saw all the Stav churches in Norway and fell in love with them. And so he came out and saw the camp, thought it would be perfect, drew a very rough design on a napkin and showed it to the board of directors, and they said, let's do it. The chapel is such a landmark. It's become a real focus for people in the area. Not only is it used by the camp, but it's used by the local congregations in the summer. Lots of weddings take place there. In addition to the building itself, it's got beautiful gardens out in front too, and rocks and pools and waterfalls and stuff that really add to the charm. Interestingly, those were all created by the grandson of the fellow who originally built it. This used to be the original entrance to the chapel before it was remodeled. And when the church was expanded, we had a fellow who did some Norwegian chip carving to remind us of the camp's heritage, and a blacksmith who actually made and hammered out the hinges. I think it turned out pretty good. About 30 years ago, the camp grew exponentially because it merged with another camp organization that was nearby. Green Lake Bible Camp was primarily started by Norwegians. The other camp, Shores of St. Andrew, was largely started by the Swedes. And suddenly, Green Lake Bible Camp became Green Lake Lutheran Ministries, which incorporated the Green Lake Bible Camp, Shores of St. Andrew Bible Camp, which is in New London, and also a third site called Camp House, which is up by Two Harbors, Minnesota. And so now there are 3 camps in the organization. It has served people throughout southern Minnesota and in northern Minnesota and beyond. So it's much bigger than it was originally, and of course now it's open year-round, as before it was strictly a seasonal camp. Karen Jensen did all of the panels that are in our dining room In each one, she captured a different vocation that is represented by the guests who regularly come through these buildings. This one happens to be justice and law. That's kind of unusual because Rosemount normally doesn't have characters or objects in it. It's usually just flowery painting. The quilt auction was started in the early 80s. Almost every church had a quilting group who would gather each month, and they would work on quilts, and then they would donate them to Lutheran World Relief or the homeless in the area or whoever was in need. And so to tie into that interest and that passion, they thought, well, maybe this would be something that we could raise money for at the camp. I think the first year we made, $15,000, $16,000, something like that. And we eventually thought that it would run its course and we'd have to come up with something new. But it has never really lost its luster. And in fact, it's grown in size and in importance. And now it's up, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it raises annually for the camp. So it's been quite a success story. One of the things that I remember mostly is how camp helped, especially young people, with their self-image and with their sense of confidence and willingness to try something new. Many kids come to camp being kind of afraid and uncertain about if it's okay to try something or to believe something or to do something. And we give them permission. And I've heard from many that was the first time that I ever climbed a tree or swam in a lake. Stuff that we kind of take for granted, but doesn't necessarily always happen for everybody. A lot of kids who came here earlier, especially, didn't have access to lakes, didn't have a cabin, but they could come with their church. And a huge part of the experience was always swimming and boating and canoeing and all of that kind of thing. And that was, I guess, very unique for lots of kids that didn't have that opportunity. They remembered that very fondly. My dad was the director when I was a little kid, so I started coming here when I was 2 years old. I got hired here as a maintenance person in 7th grade, and by the time I got to high school, I was one of the counselors on the camp. I met probably some of the best friends I've ever had here at camp, and I'm still in touch with many of them. I met my wife here. Both of our children worked here, and it was wonderful to see them kind of stepping into our shoes. I no longer work here, I'm retired, but I still feel a part of this family and come quite often to have coffee, and I volunteer. I credit Green Lake Bible Camp with some of the most profound experiences that I have had in my life. The people I met, the things I learned, how I felt, it was powerful.
Postcards is made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota. Additional support provided by Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, Mark and Margaret Yakel-Julien on behalf of Shalom Hill Farms, a retreat and conference center in a prairie setting near Windham, Minnesota. On the web at shalomhillfarm.org. Alexandria, Minnesota, a year-round destination with hundreds of lakes, trails, and attractions for memorable vacations and events. More information at explorealex.com. The Lake Region Arts Council's Arts Calendar, an arts and cultural heritage funded digital calendar showcasing upcoming art events and opportunities for artists in West Central Minnesota. On the web at lrac4calendar.org. Playing today's new music plus your favorite hits. 96.7 Cram. Online at 967cram.com.